This is Hittin' 50, the fitness and wellness podcast serving the over 50 community. I'm your host, Chris Cotnoir. Welcome to episode 5 of the Hittin' 50 podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cotnoir. This week's episode focuses entirely on mental well-being, the fourth and perhaps most important pillar of maintaining a healthful lifestyle. Before we get to the episode, I just wanted to remind you that if you are enjoying the podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe. It helps with discoverability. You can follow me on Twitter or X at @CCotnoir, Instagram at @CCotnoir, Facebook at Christopher Cotnoir, and LinkedIn at Chris Cotnoir. You can also subscribe to my Substack newsletter at hittin50.substack.com. Perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of our health is our mental well-being, not because it's not important, but because it's difficult to measure and action. When your doctor says you need to exercise more, eat better, or sleep more, we may not necessarily know exactly what to do to achieve those goals, but at least we know what we need to address. Aside from clinical diagnoses of mental illness, it's not always clear what exactly it is I need to be doing to maintain my mental well-being. Fortunately, our first guest can shed some light on this very question. Here's my in-depth conversation with Dr. Kavita Patel, who helps structure a definition around mental well-being, how it's measured in a clinical setting, and strategies for helping you to maintain your mental health. I'd like to welcome back Dr. Kavita Patel. Kavita appeared on the first episode of the Hittin' 50 podcast, and she's back today to talk about mental well-being, which is the subject of this episode. Just a reminder that Kavita is a practicing physician. She's served as health policy advisor in the Obama administration. She's a Stanford professor. She's an MSNBC commentator. Among many other things, and probably her most important job is mom. But welcome back, Kavita.
Thank you so much. This is one of my favorite podcasts, Chris. I'm excited to talk today.
All right,
it is. It's like the podcast that it's probably the podcast we all need, and because there's a lot we probably don't need. None of them are on the DSR network, I should say. So I'm going to put a plug in for the fact that you executive produce one of my podcasts that I love. So yes. I'm very, very happy to talk.
Yes, and we enjoy having you. And frankly, this for me is cathartic because I get to learn about all kinds of different things from different types of people. And I don't have to sit there in front of my computer and think about, what am I going to write this week?
Yeah.
I can just go and talk to, friends and experts and people like yourself. So
I love it. Cool. Well, what do you want to talk about today?
Yeah, so mental well-being to me is a little squishier than some of the other things, meaning, when somebody says, you need to exercise more, you need to eat better, those are easily quantifiable, they're actionable. You might not necessarily know exactly what to do, but you have a sense of, okay, I'm not exercising enough, I need to walk, I need to run, I need to do this. I'm eating burgers every day. Maybe I should lay off, the red meat. But when we talk about focusing on your mental well-being, I don't have a good sense of what that actually means or how I can actually action it. So what's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting mental well-being, or this concept of well-being, has kind of emerged. It seems like it's more in vogue. It certainly is something we use a lot more in the kind of 21st century, but it goes back to like almost a century of research around trying to define things like happiness. So instead of happiness, there's like a composite set of like questions that lead to what we call a well-being index. And I think that's how you've started to see this like phrase getting incorporated more formally in healthcare, but now also in like the lay environment, right? Like well-being in general. And I think that the key takeaways for me are what those composite kind of questions are that go into the well-being index. So kind of number one, it's around social isolation, or what we would call loneliness. Those two are different, but in general, like social isolation. Number two is also kind of pleasure. There's a concept that we use to screen for depression called anhedonia. So how much pleasure you take in things. So for example, if I know, Chris, that you love swimming, you love exercising, but then all of a sudden I see over time that you're like, I just don't want to exercise anymore. And it's not because you don't want to be fit, but it's because it doesn't bring you as much pleasure. That's part of your well-being, and kind of how I would determine your well-being is actually like being harmed because you're not exercising, but not for the obvious reasons. It's because you don't take pleasure in it. And then there are other aspects of well-being that are very basic and actually easy to measure, even more so with all the wearables we have now, like sleep. I think that I personally have never appropriately realized how much sleep factors into everything, like literally everything: your exercise, your nutrition, your well-being, everything. And how you show up as a parent, how you show up as a kid, how you show up as a spouse, all of the above. So I think that's the better way to think about well-being, is to break it down into those pieces that actually go into kind of what we would call a well-being index.
And is the well-being index an actual questionnaire that
It is.
you use in your practice?
I don't, because it takes a long time to administer. So we don't. So what is standard practice in every primary care practice for sure is a 2-question screener for depression. And that's usually like, in the past 2 weeks, have you had like any trouble sleeping or eating? And then in the past 2 weeks, have you had less pleasure, or had, problems with having like pleasure in activities or in friendships or relationships? And that's anhedonia. So really, we don't do a full well-being index. There are psychologists and some psychiatrists who will do kind of this full well-being questionnaire, but it really has more to do with understanding these underlying pieces, less to do with like kind of a standard screening questionnaire.
And with regard to those 2 questions, if somebody
Mhm.
answer, yes, I am having trouble sleeping, or yes,
Uh-huh.
I've felt alone, or whatever,
Less
does
pleasure.
that
Mhm.
would you refer them to somebody?
No. We trigger and do what's called a PHQ-9. That we go from 2 questions to 9 questions, and we score you on how kind of, then we know based on the responses to the 9 questions. If you screen positive from those 9 questions and get a certain score or higher, then you probably meet the criteria for either a diagnosis of, depression or dysthymia. You can kind of have a formal diagnosis. In primary care, I often personally will start and initiate. I mean, there's no question that if you know that somebody meets the criteria for depression, I feel an obligation to talk to them about therapeutic options. That includes medication. But generally, what it does is trigger drawing labs and screening for other causes for depression. That could be medical, thyroid, other conditions. And then also initiating potentially a referral to a psychologist to see if cognitive behavioral therapy, or if there is a role that psychotherapy could play. There is a whole kind of field of medicine now that I know you've talked about in this, it wasn't in this pod, I think it was some other pods, but I know we've talked about like psychedelics and kind of the use of like what's coming now more into, I would say, more popular medicine around psilocybin, psychedelics, and some of these things to unlock ketamine, to kind of unlock some of these like factors and emotions, trauma, things like that. But generally, screening positive on some of these questionnaires starts this workup for either depression, or there are anxiety screeners as well that we can add on top of that if we think that what's really happening is more of an anxiety feature. So there's a lot of basically well-being, and a lot of the diagnoses that kind of we talk about tend to have standardized questions that have been validated over decades. But if you're just sitting there, not in a doctor's office, trying to think about your own well-being, I go back to those basics. Do you take pleasure in what you're doing? Have you changed patterns? Are you having problems sleeping? Have you noticed that this is affecting your relationships? That tends to be what real well-being means to, I think, you and me.
Yeah. So, well, in terms of recommendations, and I'm speaking from a preventive standpoint.
Yeah,
So, what are the kinds of things or the kinds of activities that people need to engage in to ensure, and again, I'm not talking about, you've experienced a traumatic event, a loss, things like that. I'm just saying, in everyday
right,
life, what should people
right.
be doing?
Yeah, I think in everyday life, people should be, what I recommend, and I try to do it myself, and I don't do it every day. And so it's not like I'm trying to tell people, like, go do this, and I'm doing it so well, I'm such a star. I think it's trying to start every day with an intention. I think there's no question, Chris, no matter who you are, you could be Jeff Bezos, one of the richest people in the world, or you could be the president of the United States, Joe Biden. And every day you probably could start with the intention of what can I do better? What are my goals for the day? So I think part of well-being is actually setting those goals and setting that intentionality. That goal for you, by the way, like for me today, my goal was I'm going to walk outdoors and go get coffee because I knew I had a whole day of like being on Zooms and recordings and just being in front of a screen. So that was actually an intentional goal that contributes to my well-being, not just because I'm going outside, but because I achieved something that was really for me. So I think that everybody could start, don't complicate it. Doesn't need to be meditation. It just needs to be planning and setting a goal. And that can be a very simple goal. And then I also do kind of feel, I told you I wanted to walk outside. I could have easily driven to go get coffee and that would have been fine too. But the walking was like my kind of outdoor exposure to sunlight, the air, and exercise. And don't overthink that either. You don't need to run. You don't need to jog. You just need to like move. And you and I have spoken before that it just takes 1 minute of a habit to do every day to then form what becomes like a more like a brained, wired habit that contributes to well-being also. And then don't try to do it all at once. So for me, it's just setting intentionality and a goal, and then trying to have each of that every single day and as many days as possible. And then for well-being related to relationships, I have often described I think a lot of what's happening in society is that our relationships come from like a two-dimensional, either screens or social media. So I've
Zoom.
also tried, Zoom. But you can have, you and I met over Zoom. Like you can have meaningful relationships over Zoom, but they have to be about the people. Like you have to like. It's so often that we're in these meetings and we're never like asking people like, what's your day like? What's your family life like? Like what do you care about? So I think that a lot of it is just connection back to basics, right? Like the reason why I think some of us miss like the traditional work environments is because sometimes it's just nice to be around people and kind of get to know like their families or, what are they doing on the weekend and kind of what might be called water cooler talk. It's turning out with studies that might be the most important conversations, and we're not having those as much. So I think it's just connecting with people. So those are all, when you look at those questions that add up to well-being indices or kind of an index for well-being, it breaks down to those parts. And then I will say I'm terrible at this. I struggle every single night with like getting a good night's sleep, getting the screens away an hour before bedtime. I've taught people to do, everybody has an iPhone or some smartphone. I tell people to change the screen settings, which on an iPhone you can do to go grayscale. So you can actually in your iPhone, in the settings, set like after like 10 p.m. If you always go to bed at 10 or 11, you can actually set the phone so that it takes away the color and kind of that blue screen and goes to a gray screen. Set that as a timer, and that automatically kind of shows your brain when it goes black and white like that. It changes the way your brain is processing information and slows it down. So sleep is a big part of that too.
Yeah, my final question is specific to, this could be a cycle, right? Everyone has a bad day. Maybe they're not feeling motivated. But when does that become problematic? And then when you're telling somebody, to go outside, and to your point, I had lunch with a friend. He is hugely into holistic health, all aspects of it, with a particular emphasis on emotional well-being, in connecting with people and having relationships with people and getting outside. I mean, I saw an article. Now they have recommendations for how much time adults and kids should actually be spending outside.
Yeah.
So like it's great to see all of this, but when is it problematic? Like when I have a bad day that turns into 2 or 3.
Yeah, no, everybody has those moments. So it's not having a bad day or 2 or 3. The time when it becomes problematic is when you know that you're also denying opportunities that you would normally say yes to. So having bad days, wanting to sleep in, wanting to just not deal with the world for 48-hour periods, that's totally normal. But not being able to come out of that is when there's a problem, which is why the questionnaire does a 2-week time frame. So that's generally thought to be like a time frame. If you're doing that pattern, Chris, for 2 weeks, then that's a problem.
Understood. Well, Kavita, I really appreciate your time
Thank you.
and advice, and hope to see you on a future episode. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thanks. Take care, Chris.
It turns out that our eating habits and nutrition also play a role in our mental well being. Here to discuss that is Rebecca Dickinson. Hi, I'd like to welcome back Rebecca Dickinson. Rebecca is a registered nurse and holistic health coach. Thanks for joining today.
Hey, Chris, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well.
I got to throw in that your segments have had a very positive impact. So last week, not only did we do a ton of food prep, but we made the energy balls finally. Absolutely love them. They're
Oh,
long gone.
of course, they don't last
You have to
long.
make bigger batches. So I had lunch with Keith Bracci earlier this week, and he turned me on to this app called Yuka.
Oh, yeah.
Why you? Yeah, and so like, it's like my own personal Rebecca in my pantry.
I
I'm,
love it.
I'm scanning thing. I'm like, oh yeah, that's terrible. I did my crappy protein bars. Oh, the score was terrible.
Oh,
Oh
no.
yeah. So I appreciate that.
Oh, what a handy tool, though, right?
It's awesome. And honestly, like I was wondering about their business model because it's free and you don't even have to pay a subscription. It's optional. And I was wondering, how they make money. Well, it turns out they actually publish their numbers like for everyone to see. A lot of people opt into paying them, some amount of money, and they're bringing in like 2.7 million euros a year,
Whoa. Whoa.
which is pretty good.
That's pretty darn good. I'd say
Y-
so.
Yeah, but the app is cool.
Very cool.
I'll link to it later. But today we're focusing on mental health. So I had a conversation with Dr. Kavita Patel earlier this week, and then a planned conversation with Christine later.
Hmm.
But it seems the more reading that I do, and we started this whole podcast endeavor talking about gut health. And
Hmm.
it seems like gut health, it turns out it's actually important to your mental health. So, could you just kind of start off by talking about the gut microbiome and, in terms of regulating emotions? Because I was pretty surprised
Yeah,
how impactful food can be.
sure, sure. So, the gut microbiome, which is made of trillions of different types of bacteria, viruses, et cetera, digests fiber for us. So when we eat fiber-rich foods, which are any type of plant-based food, they start to digest that fiber for us. And when they digest that fiber, they release something into your bloodstream called short chain fatty acids. And these short chain fatty acids do a lot of the repair work locally within the gut, but then they also feed and help produce a variety of neurotransmitters that affect your overall sense of well-being. So I'll talk about just real quickly here serotonin, which we're all kind of familiar with. It's sort of that feel-good neurotransmitter. 95% of that is found within the gut. And if you've got a healthy gut microbiome, you're going to have healthy production of that particular neurotransmitter. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter that we're pretty familiar with. And 50% of dopamine is found within the gut. So if you are eating a diet that is fiber rich, you are going to be allowing the gut to work to its, most optimal and be able to have optimal levels of these neurotransmitters. So the gut is essentially our second brain, and it's constantly communicating back and forth from our actual brain via the vagus nerve, which is the largest cranial nerve that comes, from the brain all the way down into your digestive tract. You have over, 500 million nerves within the gut that are constantly providing feedback up and down to your brain. So it's really interesting how everything ties back to gut health.
So first of all, I feel like every single person that I talk to has the coolest job ever. And talking about gut health might seem, not that exciting, but I am freaking fascinated by this because of all of the various parts of your body it touches. So maybe talk a little bit about if you are constantly eating a diet that's high in processed foods or high in fats, saturated fats, what is that doing to us in terms of the production of serotonin and dopamine?
So sure. So if you're eating a diet that's the standard American diet, we call that the SAD diet, which is highly processed, you are feeding the wrong microbes. So there are microbes within your gut that are pro-inflammatory. And those particular microbes will start to proliferate. And when they do, you develop that gut dysbiosis. So now you've got sort of too many bad for you microbes and not enough of the good for you microbes. And you are not getting the most out of the production of those short chain fatty acids and the production of those neurotransmitters.
I was joking earlier about the app, but one of the things that app actually does is, it'll show you alternatives to the foods. But the other thing that it does it shows you hazardous substances that are in not only your food, but if you are feeling adventurous and you want to scan your cosmetics, there's a lot
Yeah.
of bad things.
Yeah.
But yet in Europe, a lot of these things are already banned. And we talk a lot about, yes, in the United States and the SAD diet and the way we process our foods is contributing to health issues. Why don't we get it?
Well, it's interesting because our FDA allows things into our food system that they don't allow into the food system in Europe. And I don't exactly know the main reason why that happens. I suspect it must have to do with the lobbying powers that be for, some of these huge major food companies. And I also think it has to do with consumer demand. If you spend any amount of time in a grocery store and you look at what people are putting in their cart, I mean, we are addicted to these foods. We're addicted to the sugar. We're addicted to the fat and the the salt in the food. And, it's interesting. If you start to feed your gut microbes with healthy food, they will actually start to crave those healthy foods. Have you ever been on vacation and you have spent, a week just kind of overindulging on foods that you wouldn't typically eat? And then you just can't wait to get home to cook yourself like a nice, healthy meal to kind of reset things? You experience that? Because I know I've certainly experienced that. And that is actually your gut microbiome sort of taking over and telling you, like, you need to feed us the right type of food, and you're not feeding us the right type of food. They actually can contribute to good cravings and bad cravings. So if you've got a nice, strong, healthy gut, and you've got the healthy balance of good microbes versus bad microbes, your gut is going to start craving healthy foods. If you have the pro-inflammatory microbes proliferating within your gut, they're going to start to crave those bad for you foods. And this is where I think, the SAD American diet really continues to fuel its own fire.
And then in our sort of, prep back and forth, you mentioned the importance of fiber in the diet in terms of maintaining your healthy gut microbiome. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first and foremost, fiber is probably, the most important nutrient we should be focusing in on eating. And yet, and I'm sure you've seen and experienced this, we are a protein crazed population. It is just everywhere. Get your protein, get your protein, get your protein, get your protein. But there's no protein deficiency in the United States at all. I mean, that just doesn't even exist. But there is a huge deficiency in the fiber consumption of Americans. Only about 3% of the population is getting adequate amounts of fiber. And when you are eating and ingesting plant foods, and we talked before about the diversity of plants, and we talked about, 30 different plants over the course of a week should be in your diet for the most healthy, robust gut microbiome. When you ingest fiber and you're ingesting all these different types of fiber from all these different types of plants, you are feeding a whole host of microbes within your gut. Your body as a human is not able to digest all those different types of fiber, but the gut microbes are. So they are the ones who are doing the digesting for you of the fiber. When they digest the fiber, the byproduct is short chain fatty acids, which I mentioned earlier. Short chain fatty acids immediately start working locally within the gut to help. We've talked in the past about gut permeability or a leaky gut, and they actually help to repair the gut lining. So they help to repair that leaky gut. So it starts within the gut. And then it just starts to go throughout the body. So these short chain fatty acids actually tampen down inflammation in your body from head to toe. And we know inflammation is the root cause of all disease. So we really need to be spending much more time focusing on fiber and much less time focusing in on all the protein that you're supposed to be eating.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think my last question today for you is not dissimilar to the question I asked Kavita earlier, which is people get into, these, cycles, right? Their habits, how do people break out of this cycle? I mean, some of it is on them, but is it, what sort of tricks do you use or tips do you give people?
So we talked a little bit about sort of the food prep thing. I think that's kind of key, but I also think it can just start with one meal. So if you can focus in on just having one healthy meal a day, you're starting to alter your microbiome just with that one healthy meal. And then slowly but surely start to incorporate more plants into your diet. So maybe the first week, you only get, say, 5 or 10 different plants into your diet. Then challenge yourself the following week to increase it by 5. Keep challenging yourself to increase that. When you go to the grocery store, see what looks in season, see what looks good. The food that's typically within season looks the best. And buy something that you've never tried before. Be open-minded. So, come to the table with sort of that thought process that, you know what, I've never tried, broccoli rabe before, but I'm going to buy it and I'm going to take it home and I'm going to look up a recipe and I'm going to see if I like it and go from there.
Rebecca, as always, I really appreciate your time and hope you have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks, Chris.
If it wasn't clear through the conversation with Rebecca, I am completely fascinated by the importance of our gut health, as it's so important to our overall well-being beyond just digestion. My next segment with Christine Boyer-Zazzaro focuses on the positive and negative aspects of fitness trackers, including what they are particularly good at and when we should perhaps take them off. Hi, I'd like to welcome back to the podcast Christine Boyer-Zazzaro. Christine is a certified fitness trainer. So welcome back, Christine. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris. It's great to be back.
So this week we're focused on mental health, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about fitness trackers, Apple Watch, Fitbit, or all these fitness trackers, which have become pretty ubiquitous. I use an Apple Watch myself. First, share your experiences with fitness trackers in general, and then we'll get a little bit more specific.
Well, first of all, fitness trackers are great for a variety of different reasons. One, for obviously motivation. A lot of people enjoy using fitness trackers to help them motivate them, whether it's to, count how many steps they do per day, or to monitor their progress in running, or for workout programs, etc. You also have the benefit of monitoring your heart health, which is extremely important. It's become very popular. There's actually a lot of cardiologists keep in touch with their clients, their patients, I should say, through fitness trackers to monitor their heart health. The one thing that I really find a big benefit for fitness trackers is for type 1 and type 2 diabetes, for monitoring glucose. And making sure that your insulin levels are at bay. There's ways that you can attach you have continuous glucose monitoring to make sure that you don't get too low or too high. And also, people use it for sleep to find out how they're benefiting or not benefiting with their sleep habits, which can ultimately affect a lot of different things in our lives, mental attitude. Sleep deprivation can cause, weight gain, a whole variety of factors.
Specific to your clients, and since this episode is about mental health, when do you see sort of fitness trackers becoming more of a detriment to somebody's progress in trying to achieve their goals?
Well, there's a couple things. Fitness trackers can cause anxiety. If people become too obsessed with what they're receiving, what the results are. I mean, they're not 100% accurate when it comes to, let's say you're watching your calories. And people become just so wrapped up in it. They depend on it too much. They don't listen to their own body. They may look at their fitness tracker and say, well, my heart rate is this, but I feel fine or I don't feel fine. So it can come into play where it obviously controls you. Also, people with eating disorders. It can be very, very, very have a negative impact on people with eating disorders, whether it's anorexia or exercise bulimia. And that it can affect your mental health. You have to draw the line, and sometimes it's healthy to unplug completely from everything technology. So those would be the disadvantages of just a few to touch the surface of fitness trackers.
For me, in terms of, like this morning I ran and I wanted to be in a specific window in terms of my pace. Great for that, monitoring my heart rate and making sure, in this particular case, overexerting, it was more of an endurance type of run. But you also had some conversations with some of your clients, and so I'm interested to understand, sort of where their heads are with regard to fitness trackers, both, positive and negative.
Well, when you asked me to address this topic, I did start doing my own little interviews with some of my clients of different ages, all different ages. And one of them, who is in her 70s, back, probably about 8-10 years ago, her husband and she purchased Fitbits, which are great for measuring steps, and they were really into it and what have you. It became a competition between the two of them, and it started like driving her crazy, and she started getting anxiety from it. And it was starting to cause friction, believe it or not. And I said to her, you know what? I said, take it off. If it's creating anxiety and you feel like you're competing with your husband, and it's take it off. And she did. And it was, it was like the best thing she had done. However, she is very cognizant about what her activity level is and how much she does walk every day. She doesn't count steps anymore, but she measures it with miles. So she knows how far it is to walk, to a certain area in her neighborhood, that it's 2 miles. So that was one example. Another one, I spoke to one of my clients who just turned 40, and she has a Apple Watch. However, she does not, she tried it. She tried doing the fitness tracking and, doing the workouts and what have you, but she took it off. She said, I just want it when I'm working out, I want to be unplugged. She goes, my goal is to get to you. couple times a week, and I know what I need to do on my own. And I keep that in perspective. I need to unplug from my work, from everything when I'm working out. And so that was, her response. But I have clients that absolutely live and breathe by their fitness trackers, and it keeps them motivated. It keeps them achieving their goals. So there's so many pros to it, but I think it depends on the individual and how they're going to embrace it. If they're going to become obsessed with it, where it's going to consume their life, then they need to revisit it. But if it's going to be something that's going to motivate them and help them, then they should stick with it and continue doing it.
I think you're 100% right. And if somebody's not in the right headspace, and especially if you're starting out and you're using a fitness tracker, I encourage people to take them off. Like, don't use a fitness tracker to track your progress when, it might be very slow in the beginning, because it can be incredibly demotivating and it can impact how you approach exercise moving forward. So I'm, happy to hear the two sides of that perspective. Christine, as always, I really appreciate your time today, and thanks for joining. Hope to see you next week.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
My final segment this week includes a special guest who I consider to be a mentor of sorts when it comes to approaching your health holistically. Keith Bracci joins to discuss his own health journey and the tools he uses to help guide it. I'd like to welcome a newcomer to the show, Keith Bracci. Keith is the person that I refer to when I say a friend of mine called me up and said they wanted to get in the best shape of their life. And I happened to be along for the ride, which had an incredible influence on understanding the relationship, at least that at that particular time, the relationship between food and exercise. But Keith also happens to be a friend, and I'm happy that he agreed to be on the show. So welcome to the show, Mr. Bracci.
Thanks, brother. Happy to be here. It's very exciting.
I want to talk to you because we're focusing on mental health in this episode, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your own health journey, because when I look at people who take, a very holistic approach, in terms of nutrition, exercise, mental health, sleep, I always think of you. Maybe just talk a little bit about generally your health journey and kind of why you do what you do.
Yeah. I don't know what got me started, why I got so interested in it, but I've always been, probably just wanting to be the best version of myself, at the end of the day. And so from really early on in my 20s, even in my teens, eating healthy, working out, being, very active. But as I've gone, I've definitely drilled way more down into the details of understanding my physical makeup, my genetics, my blood work, what works for my body, which is a personal journey that I recommend for everyone.
When I was originally talking to you about topics for this episode, I talked about meditation because I know that, we're not just talking about, 5-minute breathing exercises with you. You actually go on meditation retreats. But you said something that was interesting, which was meditation is a tool in the sort of mental health toolbox. So talk to me about the mental aspects of, how you try, maintain a healthful lifestyle.
Sure. I mean, we were talking about it just before we started, and, staying healthy is not complicated. It's pretty simple, actually. You eat healthy food, whole foods, meats, veggies, fruits, vegetables, eggs, nuts, it's not that complicated. Just eat whole food. Exercise, just get moving, get your heart rate up, get your sweat on, exert yourself each day, get some sleep. I mean, it's really basic stuff, but what we all know, this, there's no secret to it. But where we all fall short is when we want to exercise, something gets in the way. When we want to eat healthy, something gets in the way. We want to sleep well, but we can't because we're anxious and something's blocking us from sleeping. So the more interesting part to me is what's going on up here. If I'm in the driver's seat and I'm in control, I could just choose to eat healthy food and choose to work out and choose to sleep well, and I'm going to be good. Then if that's what I want to do, why am I not doing? What's actually making the choices for me? And that's where something like meditation comes into play, because you take the time, you sit, and you get internal, and you start to understand what's actually going on in there. And I don't think many people do it. And even when you talk about meditation, a lot of people are counting their breath and, they're doing a mantra, and that's all nice for like stress relief. But for actually understanding your own mind, what is inside of you that is driving you, I don't think there's a lot of people out there really asking those questions and spending the time to understand themselves in that way. And I think that is kind of the way to stay healthy, both mentally and physically.
Do you think that you need somebody to guide you in those areas? I mean, how accessible is meditation, but mental health? And you talked about this holistic approach, and I agree that it's conceptually simple. Eating well, sleeping well, and exercising. But those are really actionable things. I think when you start talking about, mental health, it's difficult for people, I think, to know necessarily where to start, what questions to ask, who should they be talking to? Should they
Sure.
seek professional help? Like, how do you get to that point where you understand what's blocking and then you can actually do something about it?
This has been the hardest part of my journey. And I've done all of the things. I've read all of the books, went to all the therapists, went to all the retreats. I've had coaches, I've had gurus, I've had everything in between. I'm part of a men's group. I mentor, I've been mentored. And really, it's just like same concept as you're trying to change your physical body. You just exert effort, exerting your body, and the result is you're stronger. Same with the mental side. Just get in there in whatever means. I mean, absolutely having help is necessary, because there's concepts that aren't going to be aware to you unless someone makes them aware. It's like trying to figure out how to swing a golf club. You can figure it all out, your golf swing. You can do it all on your own, or you could just talk to a pro who went to school to teach people how to do it, and they can just show you. It's like 1,000 times better. So having help is big, therapist, coach, others, other people in this space who are asking these questions that you can talk to on a daily basis. I'm surrounded by a big network of people who are asking these same questions, wondering the same things, and getting into the same places. So you get exponential more results that way.
Who are the gurus? Who are the people that you listen to the most to kind of help our readers? And where would you point people who are looking to get started?
Yeah, I mean, on the physical side, you and I talked about it at lunch. Like, I'm into Peter Attia, or Huberman, or Sinclair. These kind of guys that are into like longevity and understanding how the body works and stuff. But again, I don't think you can do any of that without the mental side. You can know all the things, and we do know all the things. Go to a therapist. Like, this simple stuff. Like, people want to drink less alcohol. Why are you drinking alcohol? Well, because I'm stressed. Why are you stressed? When it comes down to it, there's a fundamental belief system in you that is running the show. It's, I am uncomfortable, and so I need to make more money to be comfortable, or I need to, at the end of the day, we just want love. We don't know how to love ourselves. And so we look to these external things to help us feel worthy of love. I need to hit the golf ball down the, center of the fairway, or I need the money, or whatever the thing is that we think we're going to be worthy of the love that we want. And in reality, there is no external thing. There's a great quote by Jim Carrey that I always use. He says, "I wish everyone could become rich and famous to know that that's not the answer." There's no external thing. It's all internally. So we spend our lives spinning in circles, trying to get all these external things to work out so that we feel good inside, when all the attention should be put inside, get that clean. And then it doesn't really matter what's happening externally, because we're okay where we are. And that's where meditation comes into play, and things like that, where you sit, you watch the thoughts, you get curious, you understand what is driving you. and then you can make the changes. But without that awareness, you are just subject to that anxiety making your decisions, or that need to be loved in whatever form that looks, making the decisions for you.
I really appreciate your insights. You're obviously a person that I respect, and somebody who has really embraced the idea of living, a healthful lifestyle, and speaking about longevity from the perspective of like, we're not talking about living to 120. We're talking about being able to do shit when you turn 70 and 80, so that you're not sitting in a in a wheelchair, or that you're bedridden, or all of those things. So I think your advice and experiences add a lot to what we're doing. So thanks for that. Hopefully you'll come back on the show in a future episode.
Anytime. This is my favorite stuff to talk about. So happy to be here anytime you want me. Appreciate you, bud.
With that, episode 5 of the Hittin' 50 podcast comes to a close. Be sure to join us next week for another episode. And until then, stay healthy, everyone. Bye-bye.